So I'd like to just introduce our three speakers to you first. We've got Sol Jaffe, actor, writer, storyteller, alternative therapist, sharing with us today the Mindflow wearable. We've got Chloe Mennick, Bristol-based social entrepreneur, sharing the Weather Report project, which is supporting mental health. And Dr. Matt Baker, a senior lecturer in human biology at Bath Spa University, and his research into the relationship between light and health and capturing light data. So first, I would like to introduce again Sol. He's one of the Mindflow data prototype teams based in Plymouth. And Sol has also worked in business, using his theatre skills to create experiential training programs and innovative events for clients across the world. Sol's created interactive audio-led experiences for the Tower of London, amongst many other things, and most recently this Mindflow project, which is a prototype funded by SWCTN that uses wearables to provide positive emotional space and restorative mental calm for the user. I'll pass over to you, Sol. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annie. So yes, I'm Saul. I'm part of the Mindflow team. Mindflow is a wearable device that uses immersive storytelling and massage to help the wearer combat feelings of anxiety, stress, and isolation. So what we have, as you can see here, is something we call the heart pad. This is the wearable bit. It goes over the neck and shoulders. This contains a sensor that basically reads the wearer's biodata. That provides an indication of their emotional state, and in response, two things happen. So motors in the heart pad deliver a responsive massage sequence, whilst the app then delivers the narrative experience, the storytelling part of it, that works to place the listener at the heart of the story in unique locations. And we do that by using state-of-the-art recording techniques. Importantly, it's the intensity of the storytelling, the massage and content flow that can change in response to the biodata feed. So the overall purpose is to provide transformative experiences by deeply immersing the listener in the experience. So the question is, why have we done this? Well, I think that the pandemic has only served to exacerbate feelings of anxiety, stress, and isolation, highlighting conversations that need to happen more often. We're an aging population and mental ill health is rising exponentially. So as a team, we have diverse backgrounds and interests, and we began to wonder how we could combine tactile and sonic content in a way that might help combat these growing issues. So for example, my background is in theatre as an actor, writer, storyteller, but also trained as a shiatsu practitioner, which is a Japanese touch therapy. But we were also made up of musicians, a neuroscientist, an oncology surgeon, many diverse people in the team. And what we found was that a lot of us meditate and use mindfulness apps, but some of them drive us absolutely crazy. We also noted that people are turning to audio in a lot of different settings, and that not everyone who's trying to relax, find calm, or a state of peace sits down with closed eyes. There are a lot of athletes, parents, teachers, health workers, lots of people who incorporate listening with a physical need to be moving. So we wondered, could we create content that responded to the user and not the other way around? Okay, let me time hop for a little bit. Many years ago, I came across this book, Imagery and Healing. In it, Jean Achterberg outlined her work with burns patients, people who literally had to be flayed alive to allow new skin to grow. So you can imagine the pain and the stress that caused. So she used a biofeedback system that helped patients create personalized, guided narratives that effectively showed them that the specific words and mental images they chose ultimately had a calming, transformative effect on them, even at a cellular level. So some might have started out thinking that it was the image of a secluded beach that would help them relax, only to find that in reality, it was a ball game or a crowded shopping mall that actually had the desired effect. They then created these personally constructed narratives, which they used to help manage their pain and stress. So this is what I'd like you to think about. Words, images, sounds alone transforming the chemical composition of the body at a cellular level, reducing stress hormones and initiating relaxation. So time hopping quickly again, here's a picture of me. It's June 2012. I can tell you the exact date because my mother is dying. Now the red shoes are mine, but the yellow apron and the blue gloves are strictly hospital issue. My mum was being cared for by a brilliant oncology team, but the inevitable was happening. So ordinarily, we would come in, hold hands, we'd chat, we'd giggle, but as my mum's pain increased, so her morphine levels rose, and she was in and out of obvious consciousness. But nevertheless, we still held hands, we talked believing she could hear us, understand everything we were saying. However, she then picked up an infection, which was not uncommon in hospital. To avoid spreading it, we were issued with these lovely apron and gloves. Problem for me then was that I knew that when I took her hand, she'd know something was wrong. She'd be able to feel that we're losing contact. So I wanted to do something that meant I could connect with her more meaningfully. Bearing in mind Actbird's work, my storytelling, experience of meditation, I considered that just because her body was trapped, it didn't mean that her mind was as well. So I decided to take her out of her body and take her for a swim. So I recorded a guided narration for her that I knew would appeal to her love of sunshine, swimming, or being somewhere exotic. So above all, I concentrated on the language to direct her attention, to let her explore the environment for herself, to stimulate her imagination. So phrases like feel the sunshine on your skin, breathe in the scent of honeysuckle, feel how refreshing the water is as it rises up to meet you. Now, to be honest, I can't tell you the effect it had on her. All I know is I made it just in time, as she died a couple of days later. But the idea is that with these transformative stories, we'd be aiming to transport listeners out of themselves and place them directly in the environments they're listening to, so they begin to feel differently. They experience the dynamic movement of sound around them as if they are there, thanks to how we record. We place them at the heart of the story so that anything that gets in the way of that has to be stripped away, and we're still discovering that process. But as you can see, this is our current setup for our Dartmoor chapter that we're developing. You can imagine the pictures show the sounds that we're recording, and in response, I changed the script as recordings came back to make it more pertinent to what you're hearing. So the scripts are in reaction to that process. They're not a static radio drama with applied sound effects. In the end, overall, what we're trying to do is create flow states, mind flow states, if you like. If you know the work of Csikszentmihalyi, who authored the seminal work on flow states, now The Psychology of Happiness, it was originally subtitled Beyond Boredom and Anxiety. Boredom and anxiety are exactly the states a heart pad is designed to identify and to nudge the user away from. We aim to create sensory experiences that captivate, immerse, and respond to the listener so that they are deeply engaged, emotionally transported, and physically feel the positive benefits of listening to environments that stimulate their well-being. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sol. We're going to go straight on to Chloe. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Chloe is the founder of Studio Menic and a SWCTN Automation Fellow. Chloe is a designer working with social challenges, including dementia care, children in care, and mental health. Chloe is currently working with SNUC, a service design agency supporting system design improvements within the UK government. And Chloe is going to share with us her weather report project. So I'll pass to you, Chloe. Thank you.
So yeah, I wanted to talk about my work that I spent many years involved in kind of creating wellbeing tools. So I've used co-design, in-depth research with different groups to co-create tools and products to help wellbeing in different ways. So I'll talk about Music Memory Box first. So this is a project for people living with dementia. It's a physical box called Music Memory Box. You fill it with objects, attach stickers to them, and you can trigger audio when putting them in the center of the box, so that it can be completely personalized to the individual. For this project, I focused on kind of working with the family, and kind of now we're at that it's been iterated with hundreds of different people living with dementia in different settings. And I also spent some time in Japan. Some of the impacts that we've seen from Music Memory Box, we've got more the kind of clinical ones, so improved conversation. In our pilot in Bristol, less medication was given to a few different people because they were less confused and less anxious from using Music Memory Box. And then some of the impacts that I quite like, so a daughter hearing her dad sing for the first time, or a husband who no longer can speak, communicates with his wife using their love song and reaches out to hold her hand. And that's the most connected she's felt within with him for 3 years. So these are some of the impacts that we've had. Trove, so this is a project with children in care and adopted children. So it's really focused on the children's sense of their own identity and the link that has with children's mental health. So we developed this over a number of years, and the idea being that you can attach objects with stickers, again, a bit like Music Memory Box, but this time you're recording your voice and how you feel about your life, rather than social workers telling children what their life story is. The child themselves speaks and can keep a kind of treasure trove of narrator stories connected to important objects. And then most recently through Weather Report, which was funded through SWCTN's Automation Prototyping Fund. So this was a project working with Aidan Mosby, where we co-designed a project with men that had mental health challenges and that were at risk of suicide. So on the left, we've got, this is someone's drawing from some of the workshops. So we've got chilled day, not too much happening. And on the right side, we've got bad day. So we use the metaphor for weather to describe your inner weather. So how are you feeling today? We made paper prototypes to develop this, and then eventually made a digital prototype. So this is called Weather Report. It collects your inner weather. You relate that to certain emotions that you've been feeling. And essentially the well you looks after the unwell you. So it's collecting information when you're feeling good to play back when you're not. So all throughout these different projects, kind of the research and design process, everything is considered. We worked with lots of different vulnerable groups, paying participants, thinking about people's access needs and working with people's abilities. And we've created tools that people can use, customize and engage with that become important parts of people's lives. I guess over the lockdown, I've been thinking about my work and the impact that I can have and the limitation of tools. So like, when in the process do they get them? And it puts the kind of, if we think about well-being, we think about individuals, and it kind of relates to the self-management of challenges. It gives people power, yes, and it can enable them to kind of, to take charge, but also kind of some issues are societal, so need addressing as a whole rather than putting a plaster on at the end, which is sometimes what some of my products have ended up being. So this is an interesting quote I found on Twitter. So we can't self-care our way out of systemic inequalities and injustices. And what I mean by this is like there's underlying systems. So for example, that came up in the Weather Report project. The men, they were not working, in debt, like there were lots of kind of underground issues that obviously affect your mental health. So this is my new question that I'm kind of asking. So how do I implement good co-design, compassionate and considered research into the underlying overarching systems and processes so I can have a larger impact nearer the start of the process? So I've taken a job at SWCTN, which is allows me to kind of work on projects to do with government and NHS at a much higher level. So yeah, that's the question that I'm hoping to answer. That's me. Sorry, you didn't see my face.
You can now though.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Lots of fascinating projects there as well. Thank you. And now we're going to pass to Matt. Matt, who's recently completed his SWCTN Data Fellowship and is also a studio resident. Matt's work explores our unconscious, non-visual interaction with light and the way it influences our mood and creativity. Matt's going to be sharing with us now his research into measuring light data and its impact on our well-being. Thanks, Matt.
Hi there. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So you probably, over the last few periods of lockdown at least, I've been sure that you've heard that it's a good idea to be going outside and it's really important for your health. And more recently, you've probably noticed that the days are getting longer, and this has had a positive effect on you. You've probably heard mention of things like serotonin and vitamin D and so on, and the impact that these things can have on your health simply just by being outside. Now, I'm interested in the effects that the light outside can have on your health, on your creativity. And as part of this project, I started off by looking at various ways in which you can measure this experience, and then looked into what we could actually do to understand what's going on. So if we look at light spectrum, a lovely picture of a rainbow here, and we start on sort of the left-hand side in the UV area, the stuff you can't see, this is where the light does stuff like helps you synthesize vitamin D, it releases endorphins in your skin, makes you feel glad and happy to be outside. And as we move up into the color spectrum, we have bits of color in the light that are responsible for things like your sleep-wake cycle, regulating your circadian rhythm, and also affects your blood pressure, can have impacts on things like cardiovascular disease and so on and so forth. Then as we get through the red and green spectrum, further into the red, we have areas that kind of influence how you respond to the environment and can even release things like antioxidants into your bloodstream. So there's a whole host of different health effects that it can have on you. And in turn, all of this can have quite a large effect on you hormonally and also psychologically in the way you experience the everyday world. Now, I looked into measuring these, so I started off by looking at what devices were out there, and I've spent most of the last year wearing a light device of some type. And they sort of vary from, and they all essentially do the same thing, but they vary from sort of like the personalized ones that we see on the left, the wearable technology aimed at the individual. They're quite subjective. They're there to hook you into using their product. Then the sort of more sort of teaching-based ones, which are a little bit more detailed, give you a bit more information, but they're there to help you understand specific context and concepts and just to focus on certain areas. And then on the right-hand side, something I've probably spent most of my budget on over the last year is a spectroradiometer, which tells you pretty much everything. It measures everything going on in the light spectrum on a microsecond scale, and there's almost too much data to look at. But what does this actually mean? Why do we need to know this? Okay, so if we take being outside on a sunny day, for example, this is a picture I took a couple of summers ago. I was on holiday in Lake Garda, and all of the effects I mentioned earlier on that light can have are probably going on here whilst I was experiencing this, but so were a bunch of other things as well. And it could be any number of things that were also having a positive effect on my health and my mental well-being at the time. So I was on holiday for a start. I was with my family. The weather was lovely. It was the middle of a heat wave, so there was an awful lot of sunlight of all the different wavelengths going on at that time. I was outside in nature, which we know also has a strong positive effects on you mentally. And I was exercising, again, does the same thing. I was swimming in water that was fed into the lake from melting glacier ice, so it was really nice and refreshing. I was eating some of the finest ice cream known to humanity. So all of these things could be feeding in. And so what real use does having a personal light meter have at that time? Now, I can tell you, if I look back at this photograph, I can't really remember too much about that day. It could have been any number of one or two of the days that we were swimming in that lake. But I can remember exactly what it feels like on my skin, and I can feel the sensation in my skin from the light. And in a way, that's something, again, that plays in with the way that the light works, and it can affect our memories and help us remember things. Now, what this means is that we need some context to put the data to. And that's essentially what I'm currently working on. So the project I'm currently working on is taking that data and tying it to lived experiences. So I'm working with a bunch of different nature writers and authors, and we're going into environments that they've written about and looking at passages they've written and interviewing them at the time of taking all of these light measurements, and ask them to sort of talk through their experiences of why they're there, what it means to them, and how they feel from the whole process. I'm a little bit behind where everybody else is with the two talks today, in that this is at the first year of doing this work, so I haven't got as far as a prototype just yet, and this is still all ongoing, so I'm actually looking for volunteers of people that might want to work further with this. So if you're interested, my address is there as well. So I will leave it there, and hopefully I finished on time, so thank you very much.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. So we just got a few questions that we'd like to sort of discuss together with Chloe, Sol and Matt. And the first question, I guess one that we'll all kind of identify with really, it's the sort of severe restrictions, I guess, for a large percent of the population who've been shielding during the pandemic. And the evidence is really that the lack of access to the natural environment has significantly impacted their mental health, and being sort of locked indoors over the last, I guess, nearly 12 months now. Where do you think there's been an opportunity for technology to help really connect and support our well-being? And I'd love it, Chloe, if you had anything you'd like to comment on that, particularly around the weather reports project that you've been doing and kind of almost tracking the mental health of vulnerable groups.
Yeah, so we started the weather report project before the lockdown. So we had a couple of workshops in person, and then kind of during our second workshop, I kind of said at the end, look, I think we may have to cancel the next one. It looks like there's a pandemic coming along. And then we were able to still work with the men, but over the phone. So it changed from kind of in person. It affected, well, at the start of the lockdown, it affected the men in different ways. Some people that were homeless finally got accommodation. So there were some really positive impacts. Some people felt no difference whatsoever because they live quite an isolated life already. So yeah, I think it had different impacts on different people. But obviously the thing with technology, it can be good, it can be bad. You can connect lots of friends and family together, or you could spend your whole day down a kind of Instagram tunnel or a Twitter tunnel or whatever tunnel. So yeah. Did you
find that with I guess with the sort of self-reporting that kind of happens through the weather app, that almost became kind of more important for people during those kind of months?
Well, actually the physical paper version of our idea did very well during the lockdown. So like a physical thing in your home. It's a little booklet, and that you report your weather and write down what you're feeling. That did really well, and we've had really good kind of impact from that. The technology kind of web browser side of it had some good feedback, but it was a prototype, so it wasn't kind of as finished as the booklet. So yeah, I think if something's in your physical life and it's a reminder for you to update it, I think that's really helpful sometimes.
Yeah, that's great.
We can overlook the physical world, and I think we all know now how important it is.
Yeah, definitely, which leads me nicely on to my next question, which was around, I guess, a sort of greater awareness around green therapy and nature-based therapy. So spending time in nature to help lower stress, boost positive mood, improve our resilience. And sort of our experience during the pandemic has also seen a lot of people heading to the outdoors. I can tell by the amount of mud that's in the fields near me that, there's a significant rise in people being in the outdoors. And so I'm interested in that kind of counterbalance that people need almost for the over-dependence on technology that we've had during these lockdown periods. So Matt, I'd love firstly your thoughts, particularly around maybe the impact on our sort of creativity of being in the outdoors and getting away from too much technology.
Yeah, you're right. We are obviously spending an increasing amount of time sat in front of screens, not really interacting with the world so much. It is very important to be outside and to experience these things, but I think there's, as much as Chloe sort of mentioned in her presentation as well, there's definitely issues around inclusivity and actually everyone having that access to those green spaces. And it seems pretty straightforward to take it outside and spend some time out there, but it's not necessarily something that people have as the full access to. We are talking about just being outside in general, so you don't have to go and stand in the middle of the countryside. I think part of it is losing it's about sort of losing contact with everything that's going on and just immersing yourself in wherever you actually are, which works really well in green spaces, in forests and places like that. Perhaps not so much in town centres, but it's still, you know, focusing on being outside is probably the main thing.
Yeah. And I guess, Sol, so Matt's talking about the immersiveness of being outside and in nature, and even just any space you can get to. Whereas obviously what you're trying to recreate is some of that kind of stimulation and that effect through sort of immersive experiences. So I'd love for you to share a bit more about, because you've obviously used a lot of incredible nature like Dartmoor to create some of your immersive experiences. What kind of locations have you been recording in? What's been really important through the process?
Been really interesting, actually. So we, as part of the prototype, we're focused in the end on Dartmoor for very particular reasons, because of locality and familiarity to some people. People hopefully would have heard of it if they've never visited. So there were a lot of factors that went into it, but we did also consider, and you know, the next part of the project will be more town settings. There will be particular paths through places. The idea with the audio is that it transports people to particular places where they might find something that triggers their imagination, and something that really either triggers a memory or helps them create a space where they can relax and respond to it. So it can be city centres where people hear laughter, hear human voices, hear and feel that life is still going on around them, particularly if you're isolated. Whereas on the other side, with Dartmoor, hearing bird song, fresh breezes, different types of, you know, there's so many different types of water sound effects. And as you get into it and you find the different sounds, they really create in the mind and the imagination very particular places. Now that's going to be different for all people. So during the testing, that's something we're still discovering. What does it mean for people? We're trying to leave space for them to have their own experience so they can respond to it in a particular way. But it is a variety. It is town centres, voices, life, and particular passages, as well as going out into countryside. My best memory is being in Finland, in Helsinki, at a airport, and going into the toilet and hearing birdsong. And I kind of went, brilliant.
Perfect. I guess maybe just to continue on that, the sort of sounds that you're talking to are in some cases very evocative, particularly the sound of water and birdsong, obviously. But what you're also doing is creating a kind of physical sensation through the wearable. So they're sort of very specific parts of the body or locations that you've kind of identified that work together with that kind of sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very specifically the heart pad will sit on the back, on the neck, between the shoulder blades at the top of the spine, and that corresponds to both Western and Eastern approaches. In the West, it's where the vagus nerve originates, and the vagus is linked to restorative effects, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation part, and also with pain relief. So that's meant to stimulate the relaxation process. It also, the massage sequences are programmed to respond to the biodata, so that the intensity, the frequency, and their pattern of play change in relation to that. So if somebody needs more, they'll get more. If they need less, it'll slacken off. But it also links to the audio, and the audio intensity, what they will hear, whether it's the music, the sound effects, or the narrative, will change depending. So if they're in a mood where they're responding to something that needs to excite them a bit more and grab their attention, they'll hear more. The music might be louder, might be more of it, might be more intense. The narrative might back off, or might be the other way around. So the idea is it's constantly responding to the state of mind that the biodata is suggesting the wearer is in.
Incredible. Mind boggles a bit how that actually works. Matt, I was just thinking about, you know, as you were talking about the effect of sunlight, and I've got that image that you showed in the water and things on your holiday. I mean, that the feeling, the sensation of the sunlight on your skin, you know, can you see sort of possible ways of actually kind of replicating that in a kind of virtual context?
Yeah, I think I've been giving a bit of thought to this recently. It would be as simple as having, or pretty much as simple as having lights that could emit light at that wavelength, which is pretty straightforward from what I understand. And it could be built into things like VR simulations, that kind of stuff. I think that you have the feeling on your skin, but there's also stuff going on in your eyes which isn't visual as well, that doesn't go to your brain by the optic nerve and goes to other centers. So, and you could also replicate that in part as well, just through having the lights, you know, shine on your face. So it really would probably give a more immersive experience to have those things going on. It's actually a fairly simple thing to at least attempt to do. I'm not sure how successful it could be, but you know, it seems if anyone was wanting to do it, that it's something you could jump in pretty straight away and trying to simulate.
Amazing. Okay, thank you, Matt. My next question is really more about, you know, the sort of negative consequences that sometimes, well, we often see a lot with tech interventions where they don't meet the real needs that they're intended to address, and particularly around issues such as mental health. I've learned even more through our work with charities who are providing critical services that design is often needs to be a slow, iterative process, you know, constantly validated and tested with users at kind of every stage. I just wondered about the sort of ethical considerations when designing particularly immersive experiences, but in fact any digital experience with vulnerable and at-risk groups. Chloe, I just wondered if you could answer that first in from your experience as a designer in terms of your learnings of how to kind of work in a sort of prototyping way with those groups.
Yeah, I think a lot of apps that you can get for mental health, they will have maybe consulted people living with the actual challenge, but they wouldn't, like, the term co-design is used quite a lot. And what I'm learning is not many people actually do co-design. So co-design is a long process. You have to build trust with participants, especially, you know, I've worked with some of the most vulnerable groups, I guess, in society. And say men that are kind of at risk of suicide, like every single stage of the research process has to be thought about. Like, what's the welcome? How are you going to email them? Do they have an email address? How are you going to text them? What are we saying that the workshop's for? Just every single thing is considered. And I think lots of people don't have the time or money to do that. Yeah, and I guess also not forgetting, like, I think sometimes we think that tech will solve everything, which it definitely won't. And like thinking about what's the smallest intervention that you could do. So myself and Aidan running the weather report, we literally set up a group meeting at a certain place, provided tea and coffee and organised that. And just people coming together over a cup of tea and meeting a man that feels the same as they do, that was like the best thing. And that doesn't cost much money. You don't need to do loads of development cycles of technology. So yeah, I think I'm quite interested in, yeah, that aspect of things too.
Thanks, Chloe. Saul, I'd be interested to know where you've kind of needed to do some level of co-design in your MindFlow project. Chloe mentioned when you're prototyping, you know, and obviously time and money is always of the essence and really tight, and you know, it's quite easy to want to jump to a solution and get something out there to show everybody, and so it's a real juggle, I think, around sort of time and working with users. So I wonder what your experience was as you're going through this.
Yeah, so it's obviously been affected by the pandemic. So ordinarily we take an embedded research approach. So exactly what Chloe is saying, we would want to walk in the shoes of a person for at least more than a mile and experience what they experience and see what they see, so that there's perhaps things that we don't acknowledge day to day or understand from day to day become more obvious when you're directly with that person. So we would sit with the test group, we would be with them going through a process, watching how they interact with it, with something, and that could be a couple of days, a couple of sessions, depending on who we're working with. And then things very much become apparent. This was something that we did in the business world. You'd sit with people and after a couple of days go, it's really obvious this is missing. You called us in to do this thing, but what about that? And they go, what do you mean? Well, we got no problem with this. And you kind of go, no, that's your problem. And I think you find that when you live with the people and see it for yourself, and then there's a bit more credibility with that. in Chinese medicine, coming from a Chinese medicine background, that helps. There's this idea that of a web that has no weaver, so that all the symptoms come together, and then you watch somebody who presents with symptoms very similar to somebody else, but the cause is very different. So just picking up on Dave's point in the question in the chat there, the root cause, even though they present as similar symptoms, can be different for different people. And that's what we'd aim at, in embedded research. That sounds very fancy and lovely. In reality, during the pandemic, we haven't been able to reach our initial intended groups directly, for fear of cross-contamination, for inability to share some of the prototype physical parts of it, and because they're under a lot of stress and strain. So we've had to pull back on that, rely on interventions through charities and our partners that we work with to do that on our behalf and get reports back. So that's the first stage for us. We've just had to do that, and we'll know that the next stage we have to build in bigger testing with wider groups to find that out.
Yeah, and I think both of you are talking to a sort of slow, iterative, measured process to get to each of the next stages.
Yeah, and also, if I'm honest, there's a positive side to that, which is we're also finding that it's like dropping a pebble into a pond, is that there was an initial circle of people that we're trying to get to, who a lot of people are trying to reach in terms of doing good for them. But actually, the more people we talk to, the more people we see who are affected, who might benefit from it in return. You kind of go, oh, great, there's a much wider audience of people who are really stressed and unwell at the moment. Brilliant for us, but not great for the world, And you kind of go, right, actually, we need to consider them as well, and how they would use it differently to another test group. And that you can only find out, I think, over time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess never more in the last 12 months have we seen tech or technology sort of proliferate, new users, platforms, tools, new ways of being online. And then as a few of you have talked about, this kind of constant tracking through wearables, like, the ones that Saul's talking through, but also smartwatches and similar. So there seems to be like a sort of never-ending opportunity to track, measure and report on everything that we're doing. And I guess new tools and kind of content seems to go out in the world faster. It would appear that it can be assessed maybe for its efficacy, safety, security. Should we be concerned at all about our safety with sort of well-being apps and sort of immersive experiences? Matt, I just wondered if you could answer that first, because I know we saw how many scientific tools that you were testing and tracking, playing with. Do you have any concerns around safety?
Yeah, I think not necessarily about any issues with the devices themselves. I think the issue is how they're aimed at the user. So both the other two presentations today are looking at things which, from my point of view, they're almost a medical device. They're there to help a defined set of people in a certain way, whereas a lot of the wearable technology is a lifestyle device where, hey, here's an insight into what goes on in your day. And quite often that puts pressure on you. If you're sat at home thinking, I haven't been outside enough, the thing on my wrist tells me I haven't been outside enough today, or I've been outside too much today. Do you imagine, you see it with people with counting their steps, where they suddenly get to the end of the day, they haven't done a physical amount of steps, which they've decided is the amount they have to do. So they walk up and down the stairs, or they go outside, and it takes over, I think, at that point. From my point of view, the use of these kind of things is to understand what's going on in the environment, not to actually drive your life in such a way. Another example I saw recently was somebody that a friend of mine who'd had on their new smartwatch had a sleep tracking function, and was sure their sleep quality was terrible from looking at what was coming out of the tracking function, because they didn't understand what the data was, and it was perfectly normal. They had a perfectly restful, normal night's sleep, but because they thought they should be in deep sleep for the entire time they were asleep, and that's not what it showed, they were sure they were getting a bad night's sleep, and it made them feel terrible. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and Saul, through your wearable, there's sort of real-time physiological data sort of traveling around and potentially obviously being recorded. What are your thoughts around sort of safety and I guess data privacy as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've sidestepped that particularly the particular point, if I'm honest, because we consider that how it would work with storing data, people referring back to it, and in the end we don't need any of that particularly for our device. So what happens is the data just records it in real time and presents it to the app, and the app responds. None of the data needs to be stored or kept in any way, shape or form. We don't need to build a profile. So whoever's wearing the sensor at the time, their data is picked up and that is fed through to the app. So the wearer doesn't see it. It should be invisible to them. They shouldn't know what's happening. So the experience that they get should be one that they just know drives them to feel better, make them feel engaged, and at the end of it feel positive as a result. So it's entertaining. It's not designed as a medical device. It's not designed to say this will make you feel better. It's designed as something to help combat feelings of stress, anxiety, and isolation by placing people in real environments that can have a restorative effect. So again, we're finding out if that works, how it works, and who it reaches best. But I think it's important to say that, you know, you consider the data. Do we need to store it? And we've actually come with a counterpoint, which is that in the future, people might want us to store their data, because they might find that all this responds to them in the real time. They get fed content to deal with them in the real time, and they might want to say, hang on, that chapter that I heard in that order was really great for me. I want to revisit it. The idea is every time they hear it, it's different. And people might say, no, I love that. I want you to record it so I can save it, play it back exactly how I heard it. So we're dealing with the opposite.
And Chloe, you talked about with the weather report, there's obviously there's a physical prototype, but there's also the kind of digital prototype. So I wondered where your considerations were, particularly around data protection, you know, when these are, you know, kind of very sensitive stories and data that's being logged either physically or through the app.
Yeah, so we went through a process at the start where we co-designed the brief for whatever we were building with the actual men. So like the research at the minute is that this group of men aren't accessing any apps, or they're not looking for anything to help them. They're not talking to their GP. So we went through a kind of brief with them. So the usual things like non-judgmental, they didn't want a subscription-based tool. They wanted it to be private, simple, that kind of thing. And I guess with the physical book, we can't really, it's up to them, I guess, to keep it private. I mean, it will be a series of weather symbols and some writing. The actual kind of web browser that you can then, what we're thinking is the paper version will then lead into a digital version. You have your own login and your own password, so no one can get to that, and it's all kind of encrypted. So yeah, that's kind of the considerations on that front.
That's great, thank you, Chloe. I'm going to have to wrap up our conversation there because we've got about another minute or so. So I just want to say a massive thank you to Saul, Chloe and Matt for very thoughtful answers to the topics and questions, but also loved your presentations. It's been a pleasure to share your amazing work. Thank you. I'll pass to you, Rachel, if you're there in the background. I know you wanted to say something.
Yes, really all I wanted to do really was to say thank you all very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Matt, Chloe, Sol and Annie, brilliant. Thank you for hosting, Annie. And one thing was just to let you know, if you don't already know, the data, the Southwest Creative Technology Network data showcase is on the 26th of March. It's all day, it's online, it's free, you can dip in and out. There are lots of sessions. I put the link in the chat if you want to click on it. Otherwise go to the Southwest Creative Technology Network website and there's links on there. And hopefully a few of you will come along. And thank you all today for coming along to this talk. Thank you.